It was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, but for this bride, things were not going according to plan. She had woken up late and was now running behind schedule. She had to hurry to get ready, but as she was about to leave for the church, she realized that her wedding car had broken down. Desperate, and with no time to spare, she decided to hail a passing bus and beg the driver to take her to the church. Little did she know, this decision would lead her down a path of unexpected twists and turns. The bus driver, a kind and friendly man, could not refuse her plea for help. He agreed to take her to the church, but as they were driving, he suddenly took a detour and headed into the woods. The bride, confused and worried, asked him where they were going, but he just smiled mysteriously and said, "You'll see." As they drove deeper into the woods, the bride began to feel uneasy. The road was narrow and winding, and the trees were so dense that they blocked out most of the sunlight. She could not shake off the feeling that something was not right. She tried to open the bus door, but it was locked. She tried to call for help, but her phone had no signal. She was trapped and at the mercy of this stranger. As they reached an abandoned house in the middle of nowhere, the bus driver stopped the vehicle and turned to her. He told her that he had brought her there for a reason, and that she should be ready for a surprise. The bride was terrified, but she also felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this was all just a strange coincidence, and she would soon be back on her way to the church. But as she stepped off the bus and looked at the abandoned house, she knew that this was not going to be a happy ending. She felt like she was in a nightmare, and she had no idea what was going to happen next. She could only hope that she would make it out alive. The bus driver led her inside the abandoned house, and it was even more decrepit and creepy than it had looked from outside. The windows were boarded up, and the furniture was covered in cobwebs. The only light came from a few candles that the driver had lit. He told her to sit down on a chair in the middle of the room, and then he tied her to it with a rope. The bride was in shock. She couldn't believe what was happening to her. She tried to scream, but the driver placed a piece of cloth in her mouth and tied it behind her head. She was effectively gagged and unable to make a sound. She tried to struggle against the ropes, but they were tight and the chair was heavy. She was trapped and at the mercy of this stranger. The bus driver then started to speak. He told her that he had a plan for her. He said that he had been watching her for a long time and that he knew she was the one for him. He said that he had planned to take her away from her life of unhappiness and that they were going to start a new life together. The bride was horrified. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She tried to plead with him, to tell him that she had a fiancé and a life waiting for her, but her words were muffled by the cloth in her mouth. He then began to pace around the room, muttering to himself. He seemed to be having some kind of internal debate. The bride could only watch him in terror, not knowing what he would do next. She could see that he was clearly unstable, and that made her even more scared for her life. She didn't know how much time had passed, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, the bus driver stopped pacing and turned to her. He told her that he had made a decision and that he was going to make her his wife. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. The bride's eyes widened in fear as he approached her with the knife. She knew that she had to do something, but she didn't know what. She was completely at his mercy, and she knew that this could be the end for her. The bride was paralyzed with fear as the bus driver approached her with the knife. She could feel her heart racing and her palms were sweating. She knew that she had to do something, but she didn't know what. Just as the bus driver was about to reach her, her phone started to ring. The bus driver hesitated for a moment, and the bride saw her chance. She started to struggle against the ropes, trying to move the chair and making as much noise as she could. The bus driver looked at her in confusion, and she took the opportunity to spit out the cloth from her mouth and screamed for help. The bus driver, realizing that he was caught, quickly tied her up again and ran out of the house. The bride was too shocked and scared to move, but she could hear the sound of sirens in the distance. She knew that someone had heard her screams and had called for help. A few minutes later, the house was surrounded by police, and her husband, who had been worried when she didn't show up at the church, had traced her through her phone. He had frantically called her family and friends, and they had managed to track her location. They found her tied up in the abandoned house and rescued her. the bus driver was caught and arrested by the police. The bride was taken to the hospital where she was treated for minor injuries. She was reunited with her husband and family, who were overjoyed to see her safe and sound. They hugged her and cried tears of relief. The bride, although shaken by her experience, was also grateful to be alive. She knew that she had been lucky to escape from a dangerous situation, and she was determined to move on with her life. She felt grateful for the support of her loved ones and the bravery of the people who had rescued her. She knew that it would take some time to heal, but she was ready to face whatever came her way.